Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. We continue our discussion in software design concepts and principles and discuss furthermore software design concepts and the mechanisms or the methods how we are going to develop a user-friendly software design. Before proceeding ahead, we need to recap the topic that we had already discussed in previous lectures within this chapter. We developed an understanding with the term software designs, and we said the software design is actually, or generally, a design is actually a meaningful representation of something that is going to be built. Software engineer is responsible, the person who specifies or specializes in the field of designing, software designing, is responsible to develop software designs. Then we discuss the relationship between software designing phase and software engineering. We divided the software design phase in 4 subcategories or 4 subphases, that is the data design, the architectural design, interface design, and the component level design. Earlier to software designing phase, we discussed the requirements analysis phase, which is the first phase of software engineering, or it is the first phase for developing a software. In requirements analysis, we discussed how user requirements for a software can be gathered using different techniques that we had already covered in the previous chapter, and then how they can be evaluated or analyzed in order to find out the more important requirements that must be provided in the software for the user. So on the basis of the requirements analysis, we develop 3 different types of models during that phase. The first is the data or information model, and they result in shape of different diagrams. Data and information model. Second was the functional model, the functions that your software will have to perform. And the third was the behavioral model, the responses you will get from your system on different internal and external events. All the 3 types of models are generally represented using different diagrams. So when you get all the 3 models from the requirements analysis phase, these 3 models are then used to construct these 4 different types of designs, that is the data design, the architectural design, interface design, and component level design. So those models or those diagrams will be then helpful in designing different subcategories of software designs. After that, we discussed the design process, in which the more important thing was the quality, since the main objective of software engineering is to develop high quality products which are acceptable to the users. So quality is the important factor. A good design is the guarantee of a successful software. So quality parameters need to be addressed while designing a software. So in this case, we discuss different quality parameters or different quality principles or functions that must be incorporated in the software designs. Then we discussed different subcategories of software designs that include the data design. In data design, we discuss how data can be organized or how data can be given some structure. So you can use different types of diagrams for designing data, such as the entity relationship diagrams, or you can use different types of data structures to provide structure or organization to your data. Then we discussed the architectural design. Different types of architectural styles were used to give structure to the information flow within your software, how data or information will flow in your system, in your software. So we have given different architectural styles to the information flow. Then we discussed the interface design. As you know, we had already discussed in previous lecture that there are different types of interfaces for a software. The first type of interface is the interconnection between different functions within the software. How different functions or how different modules or how different components within the software will interact with one another. So you have to provide the interfaces for the communication between different functions. So this is one type of interface. The second type of interface is how your software will interact with the internal and external entities. For example, the internal entities may be some other software. So how your software will interact with other software. For example, you have developed a web application. If that web application requires some database, so database is a separate software. So how your application, your software will interact that database application. So this is the interface, and similarly, if your software has to interact with some other hardware, that is the external entity. So this type of interface is the second interface in which your software has to deal or has to interact with different internal or external entities. The third type of interface, which is also the interaction with the external entity, is the user interface, in which the user has to interact or has to communicate with the software. So this type of interface, your software has to communicate with the user. Such type of interface is known as user interface. So you need to provide mechanisms for the user so that user can feel comfortable in using the application or in interacting with the application. So in previous lecture we were discussing the user interface design, or this particular type of design. The interface design mainly focuses on designing the user interface. So when we were discussing the user interface design, we discussed different rules that we named as the golden rules for designing the user interface. So three golden rules need to be kept in mind while designing the user interface. The first golden rule says the user must be in control. Place the user in control. That means the user must be in charge of the software system. He should feel that he is controlling the system, not that the system is controlling him. The second rule says reduce the burden on user's memory. User should not be pushed to memorize different things, to memorize the past activities he has performed, to memorize the past actions he had performed on the system. So you need to reduce the burden from user memory. So system must memorize things for the user in order to help him to navigate throughout the software. While the third rule is the interface must be consistent. That means user should feel that he is using the same software no matter where he is moving within the software. The background colors, the text font size should be same, the color schemes should be same, the graphics should be same, so that he could feel that he is moving within the same software. If you change the text sizes, if you change the colors, if you change the interaction mechanisms, the user may feel that he is using some other software if such changes are occurring rapidly. So these are the golden principles while designing the user interface. So these were the things we had discussed in the previous lecture. Now let's proceed with the today's discussion. We'll continue our discussion on user interface design and see how different methods can be used and what different methods can be actually used to design a user-friendly user interface for the user. Let's now proceed with the discussion. The overall process for designing user interface generally begins with the creation of different models of system function. The human and computer-oriented tasks that are required to achieve system function are then delineated. The design issues that apply to all interfaces designs are then considered. Tools are selected to develop proper prototype, and ultimately it is the time to then implement the design. And finally, at the end, once the design has been implemented, the design is then evaluated for the quality. So the first phase while designing user interface is that we have to design different types of models. If you remember, in requirements analysis, we also developed different models there. 3 different models were developed: data model, data or information model, the function model, and behavioral model, if you remember that. So similarly, for designing the user interface, you have to now design different models. So we have 4 different models here when you are to design the user interface. The first model is known as the user model. The first model is the user model. What is a user model? This is actually the designing or collection of the profiles of all the people, all the end user who are going to interact with the system. So you have to now develop the user model. So collection or designing of the profiles of all the users and users who are going to interact with the system. The second model is known as the design model. Software engineer generally creates the design model, which is the design realization of user model. How different user models which we have already developed are going to be integrated into the design. We are going to discuss all of them one by one in detail. And then the third model is the end user develops a mental image that is often called as the system perception. So user generally carries a mental image about the thing that is going to be built. So it is known as the system perception or mental model, you can call it. And the fourth model is the system actual image. That means the look and feel of your system, of the interface, coupled with the supporting information describing the interface syntax and semantics, how the system or how the interface will look. So these are the 4 different types of models. Now let's discuss all of them one by one in detail. The first model is the user model. As we said, we have to prepare profiles for all the end users in this case. So the user model establishes the profile of all the end users of the system. To build an effective user interface, all design should begin with an understanding of the intended users, including profiles of their age, gender, physical abilities, education, cultural or ethical backgrounds, motivations, goals, and personalities. So you have to prepare the profiles of the user who are going to use the system using all these parameters. So we can categorize users in 3 categories. The first category can be the novices, the novice user. Those who have no syntactic knowledge of the system and have little semantic knowledge of the application that is going to be built. So those people who have little or no knowledge about the application, those are known as the novice users. The second category of users are the knowledgeable intermittent users. Those who are having responsible semantic knowledge of the application but relatively low recall of syntactic information necessary to use the system. That means they do understand the software but have little information about how to use them. Well, the third type of user profile can be the knowledgeable, frequent users. Those having good semantic and syntactic knowledge that often leads to the power user syndrome. That is, those individuals who look for the shortcuts and abbreviated modes of interaction, those who are quite fluent with the software and they look for the shortcuts, how to make things happen in less possible time. So these are the frequent users, those who have already interacted with similar sort of applications. So generally these three profiles or the three categories of users can be divided. Now the second model is the design model. The design model for the entire system actually incorporates the data, architectural, interface and component level representation of the software, all the four sub-designs that we had already discussed. The requirement specification may establish certain constraints that help to define the user of the system, but the interface defined is often only accidental to the design model. So here in design model, we now have to convert the user profiles into the mode of interactions. For the novice user, you have to provide the easy mode of interaction so that they can understand the meaning and use of different types of controls that you have provided. For the intermediate users, those who have little knowledge about the software but have less knowledge about how to use the software. So for that you have to provide the intermittent level of interaction mechanism, and for the frequent users, those who are knowledgeable and have used such type of softwares in past, for those you have to then provide different types of shortcuts or mnemonics, you can say. So you have to now convert the user models in reality, and this is what is done in the design model. The third model is the system perception. So the system perception is actually the image of the system that end users carry in their mind about the software. For example, if the user of the word processor software were asked to describe its operation, the system perception would guide the response. The accuracy of the description will depend upon the user's profile. For example, the novice user would provide a sketchy response at best, and overall familiarity with software in the application domain. A user who understands word processor fully but has worked with the specific word processor only once might actually be able to provide a more complete description of its function than the one who is novice user, who has spent weeks trying to learn the system. So this is in system perception. You now have to elaborate the user mind. You have to now try to ask the user to explain different functions that you are going to provide in the software and how the user think about them. So a frequent user who has already interacted with similar software would give more accurate explanation to functions, while a novice user may not be that elaborative. So here you have to now read the mental image of user. The third model is the system image. The system image combines the outward manifestation of the computer-based system coupled with all the supporting information such as the books, manuals, videotapes, help files, etc., that describe system syntax and semantics. So once the complete system is developed, so how different interaction can be provided, that should be provided in sort of some help. Help can be in help menu, that can be through some tapes, that can be through some lectures, that can be through some books, etc. So you have to now provide the syntax and semantics of the interface to the user using through some help means. When the system image and the system perceptions are coincident, users generally feel comfortable with the software and use it effectively. So if you have understood the user models, the levels of user profiles have been categorized, and then you have developed the system image. So every category of user will be quite convenient in using the software, as they will be having the level of interaction they require in using the software. In order to accomplish this melding of the models, the design model must have been developed to accommodate the information contained in the user model. So you have to provide the mechanism on the basis of user profiles. Then your system image must accurately reflect the syntactic and semantic information about the interfaces. So you have to convert the user model into reality within the system image. The models described, these four types of model, are actually the abstractions of what the user is doing or thinks he is doing, or what somebody else thinks he ought to be doing when he uses an interface system. So these four models are actually on the basis of user's perception about what he is going to do with the application. Along with this, these four models enables the interface designer to satisfy a key element of the most important principle of user interface design, which is know the user, know the tasks. We are going to discuss design principles in the coming lecture, but the important principle, one of them that we will be discussing, is that know your user and know their tasks. So these four models actually is, we are trying to understand the users and their actions, what they are going to do and how they are going to perform their task on the system. So these four models will help in understanding your user and understanding their tasks. Now we have to see the user interface design process, how this process goes on. The design process for user interface is iterative. As we had already said, you cannot develop a perfect design at one go or in one stance. It is an iterative process or a repeated process. You have to go again and again, refine your designs again and again until you come up with the final design for the software. The user interface design process encompasses four distinct framework activities, as I had discussed, or I have drawn it in this diagram. These are the four activities that are generally performed when you design the user interface. First activity is user, task and environment analysis and modeling that we had just done in this previous models topic. The second activity is designing the interface. Third activity is the interface construction, and the fourth activity is the validation of the interface. So the spiral in this diagram here, you can see I have represented these 4 activities in a spiral diagram. So this spiral actually implies that each of these tasks will occur more than once. So every spiral here you can see is moving around completely. That means it is an iterative activity. It will go on and on and on until and unless you develop a final design. So actually the starting begins from the central point like this. It moves then out. Let me redraw it here. So starting from the small scale like this, it moves on and on and on again until you develop a final design which is quite in detail. So you start from abstract design and go on the more refinement, towards more refinement. With every pass around the spiral representing additional elaboration of requirements and the result in design. So the more you move on the spiral, the more elaborations are then highlighted in your designs. In most cases, the implementation activity involves prototyping. So generally, the designs are also implemented using prototypes. If you remember, we discussed the prototyping model in one of the chapters. So you can also develop prototypes for your designs. So this is the only practical way to validate what has been designed. So for the validation, you need to develop the prototype for the design. The first analysis activity focuses on the profiles of the user who will interact with the system. The first activity that states the user, task, environment, analysis, and modeling. So this is the first activity that you have to perform in the interface designing process. Here you have to understand the skill level, business understanding, and general receptiveness to the new system, and different user categories are identified that we have already defined here in the above section. For each user category, requirements are collected. Along with this, the software engineer attempts to understand the system perception for every class of users, how user thinks about the system. So the software engineer needs to understand their needs or their perception about the system. So once general requirements have been defined, a more detailed task analysis is then conducted. Those tasks that the user perform in order to accomplish the goals for the system are then identified. So first you have to define the user, categorize the user in first case, then you have to identify the task that every category of user needs to perform on the system. So those tasks are identified, described, and elaborated. And then the analysis of the user environment needs to happen that mainly focuses on the physical work environment. So for analyzing the user environment, you can ask some of the questions such as where will the interface be located physically? Will the user be sitting, standing, or performing other tasks unrelated to the interface? Does the interface hardware accommodate space, light, or noise constraints? Are there special human factors, consideration driven by the environment factor? So, after the information collected as part of the first activity, which is the user, task, and environment analysis activity, so this information then used to create an analysis model to the interface. Using this model as a basis, the design activity then goes on. Then we move to the second activity, which is the interface design activity. The goal of this interface design activity is to define a set of interface objects and actions that enables a user to perform all defined tasks in a manner that meets every usability goal defined for the system. So, in interface designing activity, you need to make the system more user friendly. How different objects, how user will interact with different objects on the screen, and what actions are to be required to be performed either by the user or those objects are then clearly elaborated in the interface design activity. Interface design is a complicated task. It is not a simple one, as you have to convert different user profiles and their level of knowledge into the reality on interface. Now the third activity, which is the implementation activity, is normally started with the creation of a prototype that enables usage scenarios to be evaluated. So now we are going to construct the interface. So here you are actually constructing a prototype for the design in which different tasks are then evaluated. As the iterative design process continues, a user interface toolkit may be used to complete the construction of the interface. So different toolkits are available which can be then used to construct the user interface depending on the task, user and environment analysis that have been carried out earlier. And then at the end, validation occurs, validation of user interface. The validation focuses on different things. Number one, the ability of the interface to implement every user task correctly, to accommodate all the tasks, and to achieve all journal user requirements. Number two, the degree to which the interface is easy to use and easy to learn. And number three, the user's acceptance of the interface as a useful tool in their work. So validation focuses these three criteria in which you have to analyze if every user task is being performed, every category of user and their tasks are being performed on the interface. The second, how easy it is to use the software and how easy it is for the user to learn how to use the software. And number three, if user feels to accept the interface as a useful tool to interact with the software. So all these four activities occur iteratively. That means again and again. Therefore, there is no need to attempt to specify every detail on the first pass. So these four activities are elaborated on every iteration. Subsequent passes through the process elaborate tasks in detail. Design information and the operational features of the interface then gets highlighted with every subsequent iteration. That is all for now. In today's discussion, we discussed the software design process in more detail. We discussed how the interface design models need to be prepared, since interface is all about user, how user will interact with the system. So you have to understand the user and their preferences first. So you have to design different models for the interface. So we have discussed four different types of model. The user model, in which you have to develop different profiles for different types of users on the basis of different factors such as their age, gender, their culture and ethical backgrounds and their knowledge, etc. Different factors are then considered while designing the user profiles, so that you can have a better perception of the people who are going to interact with the system. Then you have to develop the design model, in which the user model is converted into implementation within the design model. The third model is the system perception, what actually the user, different levels of user carry in their mind about the system, how they are going to interact with them. So you have to understand the perception of the user in the perception model, in the system perception. And the fourth one is the system image. The final one is the system image, which is actually the implementation of the system, in which you have to convert every category of user and their perception about the system into reality in terms of, or in shape of, a prototype, design prototype. Then we discussed the user interface design process, what activities are involved in designing the user interface. So as we said that it is an iterative process. Designing of a software is an iterative process. You cannot develop or you cannot design the software in one go. So you have to start from small and move towards large. So it is an iterative process. You have to move in spiral. So different activities are to be performed while designing the software. The first activity is you have to understand the user, that we have already done in previous section when we were discussing the different models for the software. So in first activity, you have to understand your user, their tasks and their task variations, and the environment in which they are going to implement the software, and the way, the mechanism they are going to interact with this system. So this is the first activity, understanding of user, know your user and their task variations. The next activity, second activity, is the interface designing, which is an iterative process. So you have to convert the user model into the system model. The third activity is the interface construction, in which you have to use some interface designing tool or the programming tool, and in which you have to then construct those models into a prototype. And the fourth activity, the last one, is the interface validation, in which you have to verify or validate if whatever is being perceived by your user is actually implemented in the prototype or not. If the interface is easy to use, easy to learn, if it can be acceptable to the user as a better tool to interact with the system. So all these things are then at the end being validated on the prototype, and then it becomes a part of the software design phase. So these were the topics that we discussed in today's discussion. We'll continue our discussion in this chapter in the coming lecture as well. That is all for now. I thank you all.